Hi, everybody. Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of the Wildlife Control Consultant podcast, where we cover all things technical related to vertebrate pest damage. All right. Well, that was a mouthful to be sure. Hope your week went well. I am still trying to get a bunch of podcasts done before I take a trip. So I'm actually won't be publishing this until later in June, even though I'm recording in early June. So, but anyways, glad to have you on board. If you have questions, comments, thoughts, suggestions for new shows, you can definitely reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. So, anyways, just wanted to do something a little different this week. Just letting you know some of the services we provide. I talk about them occasionally, but I also I also want you to be aware of a training that we have, how to bait, cage, and box traps like a professional. It's under our store area under services, and so you can see some of the services there. So basically, it is a series of short video clips explaining how to bait, cage, and box traps. You may say, well, that seems kind of weird. Shouldn't it be very easy? Well, yes and no, but it talks about the theory and elements of baiting your cage trap to make it more attractive to animals to enter. A lot of people, the difference between a professional and just someone who's just doing it on the sideline is a professional has to make sure he reduces mistakes. And when you're home and you're just able to check the trap out the back window, you don't have to be quite as technical because you're not driving 30 minutes to get to that particular location, right? So these are some strategies if you're interested in that. And then there's also literature that I provide you as well on some baiting suggestions. But, anyways, if you're interested in that, definitely check that out and some of the other services that we provide at the website. All right, enough of that. So let's get on with our presentation for this week. I thought I would talk a little bit about basic cage trapping. So a lot of people think that they truly understand cage trapping, and the reality is they don't. Sometimes the simplicity of something actually makes it harder to learn because you're just like, oh, well, it's just obvious. Well, when you get a little deeper into uh, trapping and understanding the equipment, you begin to become a little more discerning, right? So this is basic cage trapping, but the reality is you're going to be learning things that you may not have thought of before as you're doing your work. So let's get started with that. So the first thing I like to do, this is certainly one of my pet peeves because even people in the industry constantly make this mistake. It drives me nuts. But I want you to identify which of the pictures here is a live trap. So what you have is up in the upper left-hand corner, you have a cage trap, then you have an encapsulated foot trap, followed by a foothold, followed by a cable restraint. So which one is the live trap? Now, you know already with the way I'm asking the question, you already know you're being set up, right? And so you're probably like, oh, I don't know, this is a trick question. Yes, it is a trick question because the reality is if you ask people on the street, all of them are going to pick the cage trap as the live trap. The problem with that is all the traps listed there are live traps. Professionals use professional language. Animal rights protest industry activists, and yes, I'm very deliberate in how I use my terminology there because I believe that the animal rights movement, not for everybody, but for some, it is a business, and it is the business of protesting, right? Because I believe at its root, the philosophy of animal rights is a fundamental hatred of humans. Now, they would deny that, of course. But if God has designed the universe, or designed our planet to be ruled by humans, therefore, any attempt to equate the equality of animals to humans is a degradation of the human dignity, right? So you can read my book on dominion over wildlife, if you wish, if you want to get more into that. But nevertheless, animal rights protest industry activists exploit the public mythology, thinking that unless it looks like the trap in the upper left, all other traps must be a death trap. And that is simply false. And they exploit this in ballot initiatives and convincing people, in my state of Massachusetts, they came along and said, ban cruel traps campaign. Well, it was clever marketing, but it wasn't accurate. And they basically convinced the citizens of Massachusetts to ban all kinds of equipment except for cage and box traps in a variety of situations. There were some exceptions, to be sure, but nevertheless, that's what happened. You, as a professional, need to understand that all of these traps are designed to catch an animal alive. They're not designed to kill, they're designed to restrain. Now, the cage trap is what's called an envelopment trap. It's designed to imprison the animal as opposed to holding a limb or grasping the animal around its body like the cable restraint, right? So I'm not going to go do a deep dive on some of those definitions right now, but I just want us to understand as professionals, we need to stop calling cage traps live traps. We need to call them what they are, cage traps. Right? Because when we fail to do that, we actually reinforce the public mythology that cage traps don't kill. In fact, they do kill, and they harm animals a lot more than people think. And I've revised a book on this, Being Kind to Animals, where I talk about how cage and box traps can actually be more cruel than a limb restraining traps like the foothold or the encapsulated foot trap. All right, so let's talk about the terms related to a cage trap, right? So we need to understand what are the component parts of a cage trap, an envelopment trap. And so I have that diagram for you here. You can see the treadle. This is the part where the animal stands on it in order to trigger the trap, right? I talk about the different size mesh weave. A lot of times people don't look carefully at that because some of your cheaper traps don't have a tighter weave area in the baiting section, right? So notice how the mesh is tighter over here. This is a 1/2 inch by 1 inch mesh weave, as opposed to the middle and front portion of the trap. The front portion is where the door is, where it's 1 by 1 weave. Now you may say, why does that matter? Well, by having greater protection around the bait, because an animal doesn't simply go to the door when it smells the bait. It goes directly to where the bait is, and you don't want the animal reaching through with its paw trying to grab the bait. So that's why the mesh area in a more quality trap is going to be tighter mesh there. Now understand, you're going to pay for greater quality, right? So if you know how to use a 1 by 1 inch mesh trap, you can get away with the cheaper trap, right? Less metal means there's going to be lower cost. But as professionals, you want to be sure you're buying quality equipment, right? Now there's going to be a place for, you don't want to use your best equipment in places where you think it's going to get stolen, right? So you need sometimes there's a place for the lower end equipment. But nevertheless, when you're looking at traps, you need to evaluate what that trap actually is and understand. Unless you know what the potential features are of the trap, it's hard to tell quality versus not. So what its meshes, some traps, some of your professional developed traps actually have 1/2 inch by 1 inch mesh throughout the entire trap, not just a portion of the trap. Again, that adds a lot more expense, and it adds, of course, weight. So that can be an issue when you're climbing a ladder. Okay, so we have the trigger, handle, and guard. Those are important. You want to be sure that the handle is big enough that you can grasp it with a gloved hand. You also want the handle guard. That's the metal portion that lays over the top of the cage to protect your hand from an animal trying to scratch you. You want it bigger than not, right? So that because animals will reach through the cage. This is another advantage of having a 1/2 inch by 1 inch mesh throughout the entire trap. Is raccoons in particular, if you hold the trap too close to your body while you're walking, sometimes they'll reach through with their hands and grab at your pant leg or scratch you if you're wearing shorts, right? So you want to be careful of some of these things. So sometimes paying a little extra can give you a lot more security. Then you have, of course, the door, and then I'm pointing out the ribs of the trap. Now, other people may call them differently. I'm just using the term rib there. These are the metal bars that envelop the trap that give it additional strength. The more ribs you have on a trap, the stronger and more durable it is. So, but again, that increases cost. So this one, you only see 2 ribs, although there is a little solid metal ring around the back here of this particular cage trap. I think this is a have a heart, but don't quote me on that. But anyways, you get an idea of what is involved with this particular trap and what some of the parts is. So when I talk about the parts of a trap in a video or a future video, you understand what those particular parts are going to be. Now, there are also different types of envelopment traps. And so the left one that you're seeing here is a cage trap, okay? Cage because it has mesh walls. Just think of it like a little prison, right? So it has, instead of bars going through that a prisoner would hold on to, here we have a cage. It's mesh and the animal can see through it. A box trap has solid walls. And so it's important for you to understand that there's benefits and disadvantages for every single type of trap, right? So the cage trap has the advantage of being lighter weight, it's typically lower cost, but if you catch a skunk in it, there may be an issue, right? Now, sometimes you want to have, or you may have a situation where you catch a raccoon and the neighborhood kids are poking it with a stick, or they're trying to feed it because they think it's hungry, or they're trying to feed it. And so sometimes on a safety basis, it's not wise to have a cage trap. You need to have a box trap. Now, the downside of a box trap is they get warmer in the summertime, right? So it means you can actually kind of cook your animal if that trap's been placed in a sunny area. Now, the same thing can occur with a cage trap, right? But at least the animal has some airflow there. There's a whole lot less airflow in the box trap. So notice I'm already letting you know that just because something is a cage or a box trap doesn't mean it's more humane than a foothold or a cable restraint, right? This is part of the mythology of the animal rights protest industry, right? So because it's not about the humaneness. They use the humaneness to exploit public sentiment. But if you show them that how you're using the equipment matters in terms of the animal welfare, but see, for them, they're just against all of it. So this is the problem, because even in some areas, they're wanting people to be checking their cage traps. I think I saw every 4 hours. Well, that completely depreciates the value of a trap, right? If you have to check it every 4 hours, or you have to buy the equipment to have remote monitoring, right? So this is kind of where all this is going. But again, I'm digressing. Just understand that you have a box trap with solid walls. Cage trap has mesh walls. We also have 2-door traps. Now, you've been looking at traps that have a single door. That's what most people are familiar with. But as professionals, you need to understand that there are also traps that have two doors. Now, some of the traps are gravity doors, meaning that there's not a spring related to it, and others use spring-loaded doors like the Comstock trap that you see on the right. Typically speaking, professionals prefer spring-loaded doors, particularly when we're dealing with double door traps. You can get away with gravity door traps with single door sets because you can control how the animal's moving through it. But with a double door trap, you want both of those doors dropping because typically the animal is moving through the device, and so you want to be sure those doors drop carefully. But As a general rule, two-door traps need to be longer than what you would need for a single door trap because of the movement of the animal. Now, the Comstock trap breaks that rule because it has very strong springs. So, in fact, you can use a two-door trap that's almost as long as a regular raccoon trap and still catch raccoons in it because of its design and the power of the door springs. So, things are changing, but nevertheless understand that there are two-door traps out there, and the beauty of two-door traps is you don't have to use bait. Okay, so here's an example of where you would use a two-door trap. So part of this is you need to know that there's 3 different types of sets. Now a set is a combination of the trap and its placement along with any inducement or enticement that you're going to have along with the trap. That's called the set. Now there's 3 different types of sets. You have a baited set, which is what most of you are familiar with. You have a cage trap, you're putting bait in the back of the trap, and the animal walks in, hits the treadle, door closes. Okay. The animal is attracted to the trap because of the food lure that you've put inside of it. A blind set is what we would also call as a trail set. It's where you place the two-door trap along a walking path where the animal is moving, and you simply have the animal captured as it's walking this particular trail. Now, there's other ways to use a two-door trap. We're not going to talk about all the different methods of using two-door traps, but that is basically how it's being used. Again, there is no bait with this particular set. The last set is what's called a positive set, and that's where you use a single door trap placed over a hole or opening, and you barricade it so that the only thing you're catching or capable of catching is what comes out of the hole. That's called a positive trap because you're positively catching, quote unquote, the guilty animal. So those are your 3 basic types of sets. So I loved two-door traps because I love using traps in places where I don't have to rely on bait. Bait always runs the risk that you've chosen the wrong type of food lure for the animal. Maybe it just wasn't in the mood for that particular food. But also with a trail set or what I would use it outside of den holes is I know where that animal's going to be moving, right? So I don't have to try to pull the animal. I just need to put the trap where the animal's already moving. So I'm a big fan of blind sets, but again, I digress. So let's talk about some setting principles with cage traps. This would also apply with box traps. A little harder to do with box traps, but you'd need to have a shovel. But what I would do with a cage trap, it's very important, and whenever you're box trapping or cage trapping, you need to have stable traps. Ground is typically not level and it's typically not smooth. And so what happens is if the base of your trap is not resting completely on the ground, it can be rocky, and that means it can wobble. So how do you correct that? So what I would do is I would take the cage trap and I would then push down on the top and scrape it back and forth over the area where I'd want to place it. That would allow me to sort of sandpaper down using the trap as sandpaper, the ground to make it level so that there would be no place where it would be wobbly. In other words, the bottom of the trap would equally touch all aspects of the ground at the same time. Now, when you're doing that, you need to make sure you're not collecting soil underneath the treadle because that will interfere with the dropping of the treadle. So sometimes you need to kind of pick the trap up and shake it a little bit to make sure that you don't have any buildup underneath the treadle. Typically, it's not a big deal, but it can be an issue for you. Once the trap has been properly stabilized, then I would often take some bricks, maybe a patio block, and I would place that over the top of the trap as well. You're just trying to make sure it sets into the soil and it's not wobbly. You want that trap to be completely stable. So if the raccoon or skunk or something hits the wall, it's not gonna. You don't want the vibration perhaps prematurely triggering your trap. Because as I said here at the bottom, a wobbly trap is an empty trap, because if the trap wobbles as the animal steps onto the cage, then the door may fire prematurely. It may hit the animal on the back and it may simply back out of the trap. The door closes, and then you're wondering what went wrong. That's what you don't want to have happen. Now, you need to choose the location for your cage trap carefully. And the reason for that is as you can see here in the picture on the right, here we have caught a raccoon in the cage trap. Again, half the mesh is half by 1 inch. Half the trap is 1 inch by 1 inch. Notice the area where it's 1 inch by 1 inch. The raccoon has stripped up the soil around that trap because he's reaching through the cage, grabbing whatever's. Remember, when an animal's caught, it's bored, it's got nothing to do. So it's going to try to work its way out. And so anything that's within reach of that particular cage trap is going to be destroyed. Listened to one colleague who was talking. He said, yeah, you mistakenly put a cage trap too close to a garden hose, and the raccoon reached out, grabbed that garden hose, pulled the entire 50 feet of the garden hose inside the trap. He had to buy his client a new garden hose. If you put it too close to a house or the shingling of a house, the animal may simply pull the shingles off the house, causing significant damage. I had one client who called me and he caught the raccoon, did a great job, caught the raccoon, but he didn't realize that the cable line to his business was in proximity of that cage trap. The raccoon grabbed that telephone line and broke it. So you need to be thinking about where are you placing the trap, what's around it, because the animal can destroy whatever's nearby. This is one of the advantages of using 1/2 inch by 1 inch mesh, because it significantly reduces that risk and in some cases can eliminate that risk. Here's an example. I have a picture there of a raccoon reaching through the 1 inch by 1 inch mesh. Look at how far he's able to reach out. Now, that could be your leg, or that could be shingling on a house. That could be a telephone cable line. Notice the trap on the right where I have a picture. Notice the stick that the raccoon has pulled into the cage trap. I did not put that stick inside the cage trap. So animals that are caught inside cage traps can damage things outside. So keep your wits about you to make sure that you don't have a place. Now, if you can't do that, then you want to kind of wrap your trap either maybe in a cardboard type box and to make it a little bit more boxy type trap, or you can use some cloth, or you can use some hardware cloth like 1/4 inch wire mesh and wire it around the trap to prevent that. There's different ways of doing it. Now, how do you bait your trap? Now, again, you may be thinking, well, this is kind of silly. You just take some peanut butter and put it on bread, and I'm going to toss it in the back of the trap. Yep, that could certainly work to catch a lot of animals. Peanut butter certainly can work. But how are you going to prevent the ants from getting at it, right? So the ants are going to love that. The ants are pretty much everywhere. It's hard to be in a place where there aren't, where there aren't ants. So one of the ways is you do this, you keep the bait off of the ground. And when you keep the bait off of the ground, it allows some of those air particles to grab the odor and waft it in. Because remember, if the animal can't smell the bait is useless. So, because he's going to smell it before he sees it. So here's some examples down below of where you can use a paste type bait, put it on the end, and then just drop it through the top of the cage. Because again, these two cage traps that you see here are 1 inch by 1 inch mesh, right? These are skunk traps that I used to use back in the day. So that is just one option for you. In my training on baiting cage traps like a professional, we'll go through a lot more, and it's $25. And it's a series, I think, of 11 or 12 short videos. I think it goes for almost an hour, maybe a little bit more than an hour, of training on the theory and practice of baiting your cage traps properly. So if you want to do a deeper dive into this, that is a training for you, and it's available at my website under the services link. And so anyways, This is something that will be that you can use straight away. At least I love these PVC pipes. Again, these ideas weren't mine. They're actually from Rob Erickson out of Illinois. And so he was very big on this. And I can tell you it revolutionized me in terms of understanding just being able to bait cage traps better. So this one tip was monumental. And so I'm passing along to you and giving Rob Erickson some credit there for coming up with that. At least that's where I learned it from. Nevertheless, you have also PPE. Now, PPE is personal protective equipment for those of you who aren't professionals and aren't wondering what that is. You want to protect yourself, right? Don't assume that the cage trap is always going to protect you from being scratched by the animal that's being caught. Okay. Notice I'm not talking about skunks here. Skunks are going to be a different situation, but nevertheless, you need to be prepared for catching a skunk before you catch it. Right? Skunks have a tendency to walk into traps that have been set for something else. But again, I'm not talking about skunks here today. But when you're handling traps, people say, "Oh, I'm wearing gloves to keep odor away." It's not about your odor. It's about protecting yourself from scratches from the cage, because again it's metal and you don't want to be scratched by it, and also the bacteria and feces that are going to be in there. When an animal's caught in a cage trap, where does it pee, where does it poo? Well, it's going to be doing it inside the cage, and when you're handling that cage, you don't want to get a scratch and then having some of that poo or urine contaminated material getting into your body. It's about protecting you from potential zoonotic diseases, right? So you want to protect yourself. I'm a big fan of the welder's gloves. That's what I use because I got big hands, and there are other gloves that are going to be available. Latex gloves can be helpful, but just understand they don't have the uh, physical protection against scratches, right? They're more of a contamination and liquid type protection. So if you want to really be safer, you can wear the latex gloves inside of your leather, of what your leather gloves or protective gloves. The point is you need to be wearing gloves to protect yourself from diseases and scratches. And of course, you want to be wearing long pants like jeans, something durable. And then when you carry your trap, you want to be sure you hold it away from your body so that if you caught a raccoon, he's not reaching through and grabbing your leg or scratching you, right? Because we do have rabies in the United States, and you always want to be careful of that sort of thing. So cage trapping is relatively safe, but again, it's very easy to make a mistake and expose yourself to disease that you weren't prepared for. Okay. Now, here's one of those diseases that you need to be prepared for, and that's raccoon roundworm. Notice I keep emphasizing raccoons because raccoons are a common pest for many different people. But nevertheless, understand that these raccoons are a key carrier of this worm. Now, not every raccoon has it, and they don't shed all at the same time, right? But nevertheless, this is a common worm, and it's throughout the country, and you need to be careful of doing this. So my point is that the gloves are helping you protect, keeping your hands clean, because you may forget, and all of a sudden you're biting your fingernails because you have to ingest this roundworm, right? It's not just something that's going to go magically come into you. You're going to have to eat it. But let's say you had contaminated fingernails and you're biting your fingernail, that could be a potential exposure point, right? So just protect yourself, right? Washing your hands, making sure you're keeping your hands clean, keeping your hands away from your face, right? People have been trapping for thousands of years, but there is some risk. We just want you to be safe. Just like if you're using a lawnmower, right? A lot of people do lawnmowers, but you still get people occasionally cutting themselves with the blade, right? Be careful, be cognizant, don't be in a rush, be deliberate, wear your PPE. And then, of course, we want to make sure you understand that when you're doing any type of trapping whatsoever, of course, I've talked about the animal rights protest industry. Here are your foot soldiers. These people believe that I know humans don't have the right to harvest wildlife. And so understand that you want to be careful what you're doing in terms of public view. Being humane to animals is certainly an appropriate and justifiable activity, right? But these folks don't believe you could kill the animals with sweet dreams and tender kisses, as one of my colleagues used to say, and they would still be angry. Why? Because the mere death of the animal is considered cruel. So obviously, I disagree with that, right? So you don't need to have, we don't need to poke the bear. You don't want to make sure, you don't want to be videotaping your killing of an animal. You don't want to be videotaping this sort of thing. And you want to be sure you understand how to capture an animal. Cage traps are not humane on their own. Animals can suffer terribly. I went to one job and I was going, they had people had some animal, I was inspecting their house and I went up, put my head up into the attic and there's a cage trap in there with a dead squirrel. And I said, "You have a trap up here?" And they said, "Oh yeah, we had it up there, and we went on vacation and forgot about it." Now, people would call that cage trap a live trap, but it's not a live trap. It was a death trap for that squirrel. That squirrel died from exposure, from lack of water and heat, because the owners of that house were too lazy and too incompetent to check their traps, right? Now that's, you can see I'm angry about that because what they did there was very wrong, right? But people keep calling cage traps humane, they're live traps and humane traps. No, they're not necessarily more humane than other things. They can be, but you as a trapper are responsible for how your equipment is being used. And so they're just like a tool, just like a hammer used on a nail is one thing, a hammer used in someone's head is another, right? It's how we use our equipment matters as well as the tool. And if you don't use your equipment properly, it doesn't matter whether you want to call it a live trap, it still can be extraordinarily cruel. So be careful out there and make sure you're treating animals responsibly. If you have doubts, if you don't want to have that picture on the front page of the news, maybe you shouldn't do it, or maybe you should get some additional training, and maybe there's a different way of going about solving your problem. And that's one of the things we do here at the Wildlife Control Consulting Company. All right. Well, we've covered a fair amount here in 30 minutes, but there's still so much more to cover, of course. And if you have questions, comments, thoughts, we'd love to hear from you at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. And there's a picture of the book I was referring to, Being Kind to Animal Pests, a No-Nonsense Guide to Humane Animal Control with Cage Traps, right? Because they're not humane on their own. I have information on there on how to use those cage traps to improve animal welfare while resolving the problem. All right. Well, do take a few moments, subscribe to the podcast, and we'd love to hear from you again. Until next time, take care, everybody.